so, and he kind of wanted people that had been, a lot of his, settlers came from the Orkney area, because they were known as the
The
farming.
north area.
Yeah, they were known as the farming fishermen.
It's a pretty tough environment itself.
Exactly, so they were known as the farming fishermen, so he wanted somebody to come over that could set up and settle the land, but also could do the fishing, and he knew they were strong stock, so they would be good in the woods as well.
Yeah, they didn't have the winters, but the dampness was almost constant up in that area, and cold damp.
Yeah.
In
So
their
that's where
season.
all my family came from, so it's, and they came over as part, not necessarily the Davison settlers, but they came later on and settled, and actually where I grew up, it was known as Little Orkney, because there were so many people from Orkney in it, so.
And so there was a wave of Scottish immigration from what date to what date, you know?
I don't know, we were talking about this here not too long ago, because there was whoever came with him, but it was another period closer into the 1800s, that there was a whole entire wave, especially out of the Orkney area, and I think I was reading in maybe the Acts in the Bible, that they weren't quite sure why that happened. They didn't know what was going on exactly in the area at the time in Scotland, as to why it was, as young men were picking up and leaving and coming to a new country. So there was something afoot, and I didn't get that part of it, but yeah, so they kind of come into the influx. So most of my family would have come in, I think, in that influx. We can jump ahead to John Wilson the ferryman, whose wife Euphemia Clouston came from that area.
I'll go back just to interrupt you one point. What I read was, you know, up until, I don't know, 50 years ago, it would have happened anyway that way, is a family, the heir to the property, if there was property, would be the firstborn male.
Right.
Those that weren't firstborn male were other.
Yeah.
Those other did not inherit the land, and so they either worked in the household or, you know, got married off and went somewhere else. Well, where somewhere else? There's not a whole big chunk of land over there to actually work with, not like Canada, you know.
Yeah.
They only have a certain area to work with. So what are you gonna do? You gotta go. You gotta go somewhere.
I'm not sure if that was the case at Davison, because I know his brother was here for a time period, but I don't think his brother was older. I think his brother was younger than he was, and he returned to Scotland. And then his sister was the one that basically ran the homestead at the time. And when the brother died, and then she died, eventually died, she left everything to William. So it sounds like she had the money, and she was left as the firstborn.
Yeah, eh?
So it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. It depends. I guess it would depend on the family and maybe their class, maybe their social class.
Right.
So maybe you're looking at somebody maybe who wasn't maybe as high as I guess social as they would have been considered at the time, because they actually ran a salmon fishery at the time in Scotland.
Maybe Davison felt there's no way I'm getting this land, so I'm going somewhere
Yeah.
else.
Could be.
You know,
You
who
just don't know
knows?
what you don't know.
Who knows?
I think he was just that type of character, that he was bigger than where his area was. Like, you know, you had to get out of the tiny fishbowl at some point in time. He wanted to be a big fish a big fish in the little sea.
Dream big.
Mm-hmm.
So you were talking about Wilson's Ferry.
So we'll go back to what I was saying about the influx from coming from Orkney.
Yeah.
My family would have come over about the same time as Euphemia, John Wilson's wife, because John Wilson the ferryman came from Scotland as well, but they came here in 1816. So in that time frame, right in that 1815, 1820, 25, 1830 is when all this influx was coming from the northern part of Scotland. And so my family came at that time.
And that's roughly the time when Ontario was populated, the southern part of Ontario along the shores there of the lakes. And a lot of Scottish went into Ontario. A lot of Scottish also went in, of course, to northern Cape Breton, in the Cape Breton area, and also in the northern shore of Nova Scotia. So for some reason, about a 40 or 50 year span, it was a mass migration to Canada from the Scottish people.
But we don't know why. You know what I mean? Because at the time, it basically, Scotland, I think, had been basically settled and reestablished itself after all of the strife. Things were kind of happening the way they needed to, but all of a sudden, everybody just wanted to come.
The PEI too has a long heritage of Scottish.
Cape Breton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to find that out.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and I didn't get that far into the Acts and Bible where they were saying all of that, but I don't know if they had figured out what the cause of it was to begin with. But, so, yeah.
You were talking about Mr. Brown's wife.
Mr. Wilson.
I'm sorry, Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Wilson's
I'm
wife.
sorry,
So
I'm sorry.
Mr. Wilson's wife was named Euphemia Clouston. And Euphemia Clouston, I am related to. So we all have connections here at the point. So Euphemia's, I guess, uncle would have been my great-great-great-grandfather. So his actually, we have a picture of him, John Plusted, was her brother, her father, Richard, I believe it was actually, they were brothers. They came here at the time, she was married, I think, to John Wilson before they came from Scotland. And then all the other Clustons came, and then when I said Orkney Town was closely made up with the Cluston family. And I live on the Cluston ground, which happens to be William Davis's shipbuilding site.
So presumably, a few people from the local village, for lack of a better word, would come over and say, okay, we survived, maybe send a letter back home.
Yeah.
And say, it's okay, we got lots of land here, lots of resources, and they were tough people back then
Yeah.
from that area of Scotland.
There's a story, and I don't think she was a Cluston. I know she was from Orkney.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story that I remember watching a documentary on where there's a female that wanted to get out of the country. And she dressed as a man and went on the ships and pretended to be a man the entire time and came into Canada. And for some reason, I feel she's related to us in the Cluston line of family. But there was I watched a program on her one day, and this is what she did. She wasn't getting anywhere in life where she was in Orkney, and she wanted to get out and have a better life, and she came into Canada dressed as a man. And that's happened quite often. Women were always kind of at the bottom of the totem pole, you know.
Yes, they were.
And still are
They
today.
probably didn't even vote at the time, I'm sure.
No, there was no votes until,
And
yeah.
a woman to own property would be unheard of unless the husband died and there was no father there.
Yeah.
That they weren't treated very well, to be honest. No.
So she was getting out the best way she could. So came here and actually became, from what I remember of the documentary, she became quite successful but managed to portray herself as a man for quite some time.
Because she had
Yeah.
to be accepted by the business community.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know from even within our family, within the Cluston women, they wore pants. They were out helping in the fields. They were doing their thing. They were well ahead of the liberated woman because they were out doing what they had to do.
Good for them.
So yeah.
So Mr. Wilson had a ferry
Yep.
from,
Nelson to here and here to Newcastle.
so you took the ferry from there, roughly where Harper's Brook is.
And we think, we know the ferry lane runs right across the front of the church.
Right.
So we either think the ferry I kind of believe that it might have come up on the lower end where the Acadian monuments are, but we know that this wasn't as high out here and there was quite a bit of debris and there was a big wharf here at one point in time. So there was a huge wharf, much like the virtual store that was like
Yes.
hanging on the bay.
Yes.
We had one of those here as well.
Probably taken it by ice.
And so the wharf was here, so we think maybe either he got up to the wharf and then the road kind of gathered and they would drive across in front of here, and then the next ferry point was just a little further up the path, and then it would go across over to Bridgetown.
So, South Nelson, when I grew up there in the 60s, was almost no man's land. We didn't even have a village. It wasn't even Corbett till 67. But if you go back 100 years before that, this stretch here was booming, place to be. This is the place to be.
Yeah, it was. Even up and through Millerton, and you see pictures of the mills and what was going on here in Millerton at the time.
Right.
Because you had the Miller family, and you had there's another I think the Betts family was big here as well. So there was a lot going on in this area, and the ships were going back. Steamboats had come into that point in time, and they were coming back and forth and doing that. So.
Even just off Harper's Brook, there would have been Appleby, which probably is Scottish or Empire Loyalist, and there was Patterson's there, and there was a whole Bateman's was there.
Yeah.
There were a whole slew of people that were.
And you have all the Browns, the
Yeah,
Browns, the Flets, and
right.
yeah, and so they were all good Scotsmen as well.
Good Scotsmen.
Good Scotsmen.
So, if you could say, is there characteristics that would describe a Scotsman back in 1850?
Tenacious. The biggest word for them, they were tenacious and persistent. They had to be to get where they were. But I would say tenacious would be the perfect word for them.
Never gave up.
Never give up. Never give up.
Gotta admire that.
Yeah. And as you read back through, especially I was very fortunate that I had a cousin that did a lot of our family tree. And he did the Flets and the Browns, the Godfreys, and I can't remember what the other one is. It'll come to me. Ambrose's. all the Ambrose, which was Irish, but the Ambrose was married into the Scots. And you'll hear some of the stories that he wrote, because he didn't just tell, like, you know, so and so begat so and so begat so and so, who became this person and who did all of this. And the stories are quite cool.
Such as?
Well, I'll tell you a wonderful one. I have an aunt, a great aunt, who actually had married a sea captain, and women were not thought of being luck on a ship at one point in time.
True.
She went on the ship with her children. She was pregnant at the time and had a 9-month-old baby. They actually shipwrecked off the coast of California, were picked up by a bunch of Spaniards, brought into California. One of her children died on the boat. She managed to give birth while she was on the ship when she was in capture. And she returned back into Canada. She actually came to visit my great-grandmother, and she's written up in a book about women at sea that you can find at the Luxembourg Museum in Nova Scotia. And yeah, so like it's just, you know, and so you think, okay, so I'm very partial to the women here, because I think we hear all about the men's stories and how, you know, they came in and did that, but the women here at the point, the women here on the river, had to be the most amazing creatures ever. And, you know, because of what they saw coming in at a very young age, because most of them are marrying men that are 20 and 30 years their senior, and coming in bringing young families and being here with nothing to have and to continue to do. We have one that's buried on the graveyard at 96 years old, and she came here when she was very, very young. So you can just imagine what life she saw.
So this book of stories, is it a private collection, or can
No, the women, and actually I think it's published through like an actual, like a publishing house, but it was called Women at Sea, and I found it. He had listed it in the family tree, and then I actually found the book when I was down visiting in Lunenburg. Yeah, and so I think you can get it at a public library or something, but it just happened to be Women at Sea, and it was talking about, Molly Cool.
Oh, what a wonderful story.
And so then it was like listed all these
boy.
other women, and there's the story of
The
mine.
first master seaman.
Yeah.
That's a woman.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty cool, right?
Yeah. So my family were the Browns, and Ambrose was married into the Browns, and I believe this was my grandfather Thomas Ambrose's sister that was married into the sea captain. If I remember, and I'm probably off, I'd have to have the thing in front of me. But yeah, so then she came and visited my grandmother Brown when she was younger, which was kind of cool.
Cool as that.
Yeah.
So were you related to the Brown's nursery girls?
No,
You know them?
no, different Browns.
Separate branch,
Yeah,
right?
around all together. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we'll go. Do you have anything else to add, or?
I could tell you much more. I don't know what you need to know, but we can do whatever. We can go for a walk, and I can continue to tell you more about Davison and more
Let's
about
do that.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
We'll start over there.
Yes, beautiful church it is, eh? Artifacts. Beautiful ceiling, eh? Hardwood or pine, I'm not sure. For the floor. And a pulpit.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot of history in here.
So a lot of the information that's actually in the building, or a lot of the equipment that's actually in the building, came from a wonderful gentleman, Paul McAllister, who was part of the Scottish Heritage, and he was the one that was kind of the driving force behind this. And a lot of this stuff is from his collections when he had it. And then we have another gentleman who's a big historian on the river, Ken Weatherby, and he actually, is it Weatherby? I want to say it's Weatherby. I think I might have that name wrong. Anyway, he gave us a lot of the other stuff too.
It's like old stuff.
Yeah, very old stuff. Yeah, it is Weatherby, I'm right.
Old stuff.
So Ken brought us, this is actually a bellows from a sawmill along the river.
To fire up the coal?
Yes, yeah.
Which would have boiled water, which would have created steam?
I would think that's how it went, to
Yeah.
get the fire, to get
I would
going, so
say-
it's for the sawmill to kind of do the sawing, right?
You would think so. I had to build steam back then.
Oh.
Look at that. You got a story for us?
Yeah, so my story here about these gates, these are the Rankin gates. So when they were restoring the point here in 1948, They had, the Rankin House at the time was becoming, I guess, a public school maybe at the time.
Did Beaverbrook pay for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So Louise Manny kind of captured the gates from the garden, or from the garbage, I should say. And we always kind of thought the pillars came with them. But after close inspection from getting some of the photos from archives the last few summers, and now we're reading her letters between Beaverbrook and her, we found out that these are probably the stones from the original foundation of the church. And they used to recycle them to put the gates on. So those stones are probably close to,
Sandstone.
yeah, they're close to 280 years old. So those pillars and the ones out at the top of the road are probably from the actual foundation of the church. So the funny story about this was known as Party Central back in the 60s. And one night, a cousin of mine, I won't say who his name was,
Sure.
but he tells us the story, where him and a friend of his were kind of down here having a drink, playing guitar, and a car drove in with a young man and his girlfriend in it, and he drove the car between the gates, the pillars, because he got it to the point she didn't have to get out of the car. They were going to have a little necking session, and unbeknownst to them, the two gentlemen that were here climbed the pillars and sat on top of the pillars in the dark and started singing and playing the guitar, and they thought it was a ghost, and they said hello for a car taking out of here pretty quick. So yeah,
Yeah.
so they're pretty cool.
Well,
They actually took the gates off of this the year that we brought in Davison's new enclosure in order to get it through, because it came in one piece. In order for the machine that carrying the enclosure to get through the gates, they actually had to take the gates off, and then they lifted the enclosure up over the pillars to get it down to the graveyard.
lifted what up?
The enclosure that you're going to see, they lifted the whole entire wrought iron enclosure over the pillars with the big tractor to get through the gates. They couldn't take the enclosure, which was too big to go through the gates itself. So they had to lift it up. I actually have a video posted on our Facebook page.
Okay. What is the name of your Facebook page?
It's Wilson's Point Historic Site,
Okay.
and we post something new every day, and lots of pictures and information.
So we're now walking down
The original road from Fredericton into the graveyard.
down river and looking towards Beaubears Island
Yes.
right now.
Yeah.
This would have been the original superhighway.
It was.
See
And
the old
since-
stones, eh? Old sandstone.
Yes, and this would have been placed by Louise. These are stones from the graveyard that probably had been here for parts of the church, and also old stones that would
Legible.
yeah, since they had fallen, and you can see the writing and
Disrepair.
stuff. So whatever, and she was known to have brought, and we'll find out that more when we're doing some more research,
Yeah.
but she was known to bring some stones up from the quarry
Sure.
in Newcastle to kind of help along with us.
Sure.
So this is her famous founding father, William Davison. So you can see the size of that enclosure was not going to go through the gates at any point in time. They lifted it over it.
I see. Okay. Righto.
So past William, so William died in 1791,
Where's William here? In
right here. What's kind of cool about his stone, it's laying down. And in 1948, Harold Davison, which is his grandson, our great-grandson, would have been here helping Lord Beaverbrook and Louise Manny to restore the point. They actually lifted up the stone and found parts of his pine coffin and 3 iron handles. And Harold took the iron handles with him, and they leveled off the stone again, and had it, there's a crack across it.
Yeah.
So they fixed that, and we've actually had it repaired again here not too long ago.
Hey, you watch your step or
Yep, I'm
stay
gonna stay
here.
back here, yeah. So his stone is actually carved by a Mr. I think it's Speaks. And
Okay.
that gentleman, we believe, actually is buried in the graveyard down in Douglastown, the historic graveyard down there.
Yes.
And I think it was his brother
where the Rankin House is?
Below the Rankin House towards where the yacht club is. There's a little down in behind the, and
Yes,
just going in the park,
yeah,
there's a little
yeah,
one there.
yeah.
I think it's his brother actually died the night before the Miramichi fire, and they were waking him in his home. His home actually survived the fire, and they believe, Scottish lore says, that God protected it because there was a body at rest in the house, and that's why the house survived.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it. See it. I feel it. There. So, yeah. So the next one down here is William Fraser, and it is actually the oldest stone in the cemetery, and it predates the church by about 10 years. So he was buried here in 1781. His stone was actually found out near where my car is.
Okay.
At somebody's, it's kind of near somebody's doorstep. And they kind of think he might have come off the good ship Hector. They're not sure, but some of his family member, from reading Louise's letters, that there's a possibility that he had relatives that came north after they got off the Hector, and he decided to stay in the area. So he has no relation to the Frasers that own the island.
Oh, okay. Okay.
He was a Fraser prior to that.
Okay.
So that's not necessarily his original resting spot that we are aware.
Right.
And then you're going to come to Ebenezer Whitney, which our fine painter is painting for us today. So these enclosures actually, we were lucky enough to get a grant here a couple of summers ago. And because we found the archive photos of Louise, thanks to Sean McCarthy, we actually took the pictures of the original, of those enclosures at the time, and had the sawdust makers, Miramichi sawdust makers, senior sawdust makers, replicate them for us. And so they came up last summer and placed them, and we're just finally getting them staying this summer.
Have you ever, not you in particular, but has ever there been a kind of a surface survey done to see where the graves were at one time?
Manny was very, very meticulous on trying to find the graves, and she actually offered rewards for anybody who had stones. And they did some rotting to make sure they weren't finding stuff underneath.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because our church then was sold in 1838, because they were building the new church in Newcastle in 1829, or 1824, I guess, before the fire, any records would have went to the church, and they were burnt during the Miramichi fire.
1825.
Yeah. So we wouldn't have known necessarily records here, because our last actual burial, there were still people being buried here in the graveyard at the time, but a lot of the church records would have went to other churches, and I don't think we have any record whatsoever. Because the new church is 1816, I think, is our last burial here, and the new graveyard down in St. Andrew's Cemetery in Chatham was 1816. Moorfield Cemetery was about the same time. So as the settlers are starting to branch out, our little graveyard was starting to close up. But they believe there's probably 250 Scots buried here at any point. And as early as 1850, you could see the graves jutting off along the shoreline and falling into the river below. So since I've been here since 2012, we've lost about 3 feet of banking. So this is an old provincial park fence. So that's been there since probably the late 70s.
That's the provincial park's color, I can tell you that.
Yep, that's beaver brown. I painted enough of them. And so we've been awarded, I shouldn't say the Scottish Heritage had been awarded us Canadian Community Funding, Building Fund grant. And so we are in the process of trying to get permission to actually stabilize the banks. We're going to actually be moving the trail system in a little bit, so we're getting it off of here. Because what we're having a really hard time with is fishermen and beachgoers coming down and walking down the Tickle, and it's stirring up a lot of indigenous artifacts, and it's actually making a lot of erosion, having quite exacerbating the erosion. And so we're losing a lot more artifacts than we should be.
Because I remember a few years ago I walked along at low tide, and there was, I would call it curb-sized stone that would be 6 feet by 6 feet, or 6 inches by 6 inches, and maybe 4 feet long, that would have been used for curbing along a path.
That's what, and you'll hear in Louise Manny's letters that this is what they were doing, is trying to build the sides up. So the road would have actually been wider for horse and wagon, because this actually was the road. And but you can see, if you walk down along the shore, especially low tide, you'll see pieces of old stones and all of that. Yeah.
And here we got where the southwest ends and merges here at the
And we're
Tickle,
coming into the Tickle.
which the local people call the Tickle, which is the land between Wilson's Point and Beaubears Island.
So
You're not taking notes. She's going to give you a test on this later. You know?
Well, I'm recording on my phone, so you no cussing out of you now.
Okay.
it's another old Nelson boy there.
Hey?
That's not easy.
So this gentleman here, who's not quite painted up yet, is actually James Anderson, who built the church. And
Anderson's Bridge.
No, he built our first church. He was the master craftsman that Davison brought over specifically to build the church. And he married into the Saunders family. And it was the Saunderses that actually placed the stone for him. So the Anderson family that is in town, like Senator Anderson's home.
Yeah, that's what it means.
So he married into them, but it was actually his descendants that became those Andersons. But he died in
So
1797.
his descendants were what the Anderson Bridge was named after,
Yeah, eventually it would have been.
but many
think there is some
generations
connection,
after.
yeah. We have some more information about him in the church as well.
Most of those stones were sandstone.
Sandstone.
Eh?
And so everybody says, why can't we do more with them? Why can't we get them etched? There is a company out west that's actually doing like an acid bath and trying to get them raised up again. And they'll come back in and re-grind them. What's happened here, as early as the 90s, I could still read everything. Even into 2000, we could still read everything quite well. But we have more tree growth. And we had a lot more pollution when the mill was here. So there's more mosses growing. And because when Louise Manny actually restored the point, there was none of these trees.
No.
There was a few. She kept a few of the huge pines. But
Well,
they
this big
planted
pine.
a lot more, right?
That's about 100, maybe more.
Yeah.
These 2 pines would have been here, but all the other stuff.
Yeah, so when we're reading letters, Sam Jago actually blew up over 2,000 tree stumps, some as big as 3 feet wide, with dynamite, and I can't put a shovel in the ground because this is a protective slot. So, and then Beaverbrook actually gave Louise Manning the money to come in and plant tens of thousands of trees and shrubs and flowers and bushes. And
Too bad you couldn't do a ground radar scan.
this is what we had talked about doing LiDAR. So the province was generous enough to LiDAR the entire province. I would love to do GPR here, but we'd have to pinpoint exactly what we're searching for in order for GPR, and we'd have to have a lot of money behind it. There's a possibility that there is going to be some GPR going on, but it's not necessarily us that's going to be doing it. There's
Yeah.
a federation coming to trying to find burial grounds of the Acadians. So they did the GPR work down in Grand Prairie, and they're hoping to do it somewhere here at Wilson's Point. So, yeah. So we know that they're not buried out here. But,
Anything to add till we wrap up?
No, I think we're good here. You've heard about the Tickle, and I've told you about that.
Oh, yes.
So you can
Thank
kind
you.
of see where our new trail is kind of going to go through if we get our permission to do so. So we'll be maintaining this and sealing in the actual old artifacts. So
By
we won't lose those.
permission, you mean by the province?
Yeah, because we sit in the
Protected.
center of 7 archaeologically significant indigenous sites, and because of the
okay.
historic relations to the Acadians and to the significance of this being the Scottish burial ground, we are protected by the province. We are actually governed by the province, Heritage and Arc Services, Archaeology, so I cannot do a thing without their permission. So they have to give me the go-ahead, and First Nations has to give me the go-ahead as well. So we're hoping they'll allow us to do so. I just have to. They had a little bit of a shake-up in the province last year, and it's just getting in the right people at the right time.
Anything else to add?
Oh, I think we're good here. I will
Hey.
take you back through and tell you,
You
about
think?
2 very important ladies in my life.
Oh, sure. No, I don't want
Actually,
to.
I'll tell you about 3, but we'll just go to the 2.
You can tell me about 3.
Yep.
I'm trying to orient myself, and
Well, I
grew.
used to stand here when I played Charlotte Taylor, and I'd wait for the pontoon boat to come up, and I'd wave with my black garb on, and then disappear into the woods so nobody, and then they'd kind of look to see, did we see what we thought we saw?
Uh,
As you can see, the St. James Church right
yes,
across the river.
yes.
We figured how easy it would have been to drag the church from right here across the river to right there.
Now, I thought the church you were speaking of was the one up by
The Anglican
Bacon's.
Church? No, we're actually talking the one right there at the Grove
Oh,
at Browns Beach.
that's a substantial sized church.
That's their second church.
Right, okay,
The
okay.
church here would have been much smaller, and the first church over there was much smaller.
Yes, okay.
Our church here was considered the Westminster Abbey of Miramichi. So you know it was an ornate, tiny little church.
Right. Yes, I spent many hours on that river.
My first summer here, I had grown up swimming in the river.
Right.
My first summer, at the end of the season, bull bears always jumped off the dock,
Yep,
off the bull bears.
yep.
And I thought, how fun would this be? And I realized how strong the current was, and I didn't swim much anymore. So I floated underneath 2 boats and almost to the tip of the point, or out to Wilson's chair there, where his tree
Holy
is,
crap.
before I could right myself to come back.
You get an outgoing tide there,
I'm done.
I don't know anybody that could swim it unless you're an Olympic swimmer.
And like I say, I was like a fish when I was a kid, but I didn't realize I wasn't as strong as I used to be. So this little lady coming up on the left
Right.
is Rhoda Peabody. And Rhoda is thought to be the daughter, but more likely the niece of Francis Peabody, founder Chatham. And when I was playing Charlotte Taylor out here one summer,
Right?
she didn't have an enclosure around her at the time. I used to sit off the bench right in front of her grave. I had been down for a morning tour, and at the time we didn't have any pavement, so we kind of could keep track of who was on the trails. Nobody had been down that morning. Nobody
Right.
had been down between lunch and the second tour. I came down for the second tour and had this eerie feeling. And I turned around and there was a rose on Rhoda's grave, and we don't know who put it there. And it's been there ever since. But what's even more curious is we're actually trying to restore the St. Andrew Cemetery in Chatham, where Francis is buried, and he is the only one in the cemetery with red roses on his grave.
I don't know what to say about that.
I know.
I don't.
I know. So it was. I never had a feeling like that again. I couldn't wait to get out of the graveyard.
That's strong.
Yeah, it was. We've had people say, it's haunted. You see stuff. I feel the moods at the point. I've heard old bells, the old boat bells coming up, the ship bells when they come through the fog. The
Yeah.
ting 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 ting.
Yeah, yeah.
Could have been church bells, but it didn't sound like church bells. We've heard people on a footpath when there was nobody around. There's definitely a mood at the point. We had indigenous ghost hunters here in 2019, and came more particular. They didn't realize the graveyard was here, didn't know it was Scottish. They were coming more for the Acadian story,
Right.
and whatever they stirred up was not very happy, because our whole summer was very off, and it took a thunderstorm and a tree being blown up from a lightning strike to calm everything down. And when we went to do the haunted tour the following year, we actually had a lady who came from England and who has a lot of Scottish in her blood.
Mm-hmm.
She actually left an offering to the spirits to kind of calm everything down. I've never had any issues out here. I feel quite protected, but that day I felt very out of sorts. And there's another story I'll tell you according to that. I had an interview during Halloween with the leader, the Miramichi leader. Beautiful sunny day like this, gorgeous sunny fall day. Come out of the parking lot, come down here, walked around the tip and come in the back trail, which I had forgotten about. The minute I stepped on the back trail, which is actually old gravestones that are laid, the winds came up, everything blackened. It got very creepy. And we beelined her out of here, and by the time we got back to Davidson's, sun was out, everything calmed down, you wouldn't even know the wind had happened. I just felt like I was telling stories I shouldn't have been that day. And they wanted me out of here as quick as I could. But I feel very protected here. The kids are kind of nervous about the crows. I feel there's always a lot of crows around. And I know when the crows are afoot and there's a lot of cawing and cackling going on, something's amiss. And so when I'm here some days by myself, the crows will actually march the parking lot and protect the parking lot, almost guard the parking lot. And so I've talked to a lot of Indigenous people, a lot of First Nations people, and they say they are protectors. And so someone's spirit's watching over me when there's something not off or not right. So I've never had any issues down here. except for those 2 times. So my next lady I'll tell you about, so we'll switch streams, so we'll get back to the nicer things and stuff, is my favorite love story. This is Elizabeth Moore, and she was the lady that I told you died at 96. She came here at a very young age, and her husband actually owned the quarry in Quarryville. And at age 80, he walked to Fredericton to obtain more property for her so that he could have her closer to the quarry when he was at work, and she wouldn't have to be alone. And she survived him by another 20 years. And I can't imagine the life she had in the 96 years, because I think she came here at 16. And so she died in 1805, and you can just imagine. So these, I've talked to Sean about this, and I talked to Tom Daly about this, and so I guess they're going to try to rope me into doing it. I feel the story needs to be told. I would love them to write it, but they think it's got to come from me. So hopefully at some point in time, I feel like I'm stepping through time into Louise Manny's footprints, because as I'm reading her words and how excited she is about restoring the point, I feel every one of those feelings. So I kind of feel I might have a little bit of her reincarnated into me, because I now become wanting to restore the point.
You could do a lot worse than mimic that lady.
Exactly.
She was probably our greatest historian ever.
Yeah. So
to date, I would say.
And like I say, this has become, and when I was a child, I didn't realize this part was back here, because I remember graves being closer. And I've talked to people that lived in the area, and they remember graves being closer, but we don't know where those graves went. Because we've counted the 17 graves that are written about. I may find more through these letters, because we have over 3,000 pages that we have to go through. And so it'll be an interesting kind of read through the fall, and what we're going to be able to do for information for the next couple of summers.
It's exciting.
It is.
I find history to do that kind of research.
Yeah. Well, it's coming down that you'll go down a rabbit hole, and you're just kind of wondering what wondrous things I'm going to find.
You don't know.
So 2 years ago we restored the trails, 3 years ago I guess now almost, and put up the new benches. And out this path, you'll see a lone grave. It's Annie Forsyth, and she's one of my oldest student that's been here for 6 years. That's her favorite grave, because she's out there all by herself. So we call it Forgotten Annie's Trail. And we come to find out last summer, Annie's not that forgotten about. She is related to just about everybody here. Her grandparents are buried here, and her cousins and everybody is buried in the area. She's related to, she was a Forsyth, but they married into the Beckwiths, they married into the Newmanses, they married into the Reeds, they married into the Moores. So this is all her family. So she's not out there all by herself.
She's not, yeah.
And she's only 12 years old.
She's with her relatives.
Yeah. So when the ghost hunters were here, they feel that they heard the name Annie. The gentleman helping them with the tour believed it was Nicholas Denis' wife, and they kept talking about Rose and Annie. I don't know if it was fabricated or not. We don't think it had anything to do with the Acadians. We think it was Annie looking after Rhoda, because Rhoda was only 9 months old and Annie's 12, and we think the children in the graveyard are looking after one another, if that's what was stirred up.
That's an interesting theory.
It is, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for your time.
Well, I could spend all day.